Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. I'm John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington Commentary columnist Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
Israel is now pounding Gaza in a way that it has not really pounded Gaza since the early weeks of the war in 2023, because it's not going on the ground. It is doing everything that it's doing from the air, and indicating a severity in its handling of what is going on in Gaza that is kind of new. I suppose that we're going to hear that they're using knock-knock bombs to get people to leave buildings, and that they're trying to be very careful about whom they're hitting and whom they're not hitting. But patience in the Netanyahu government is at an end. The 57 days of ceasefire came to an end after literally 57 days of negotiations with Hamas led to almost nothing. I mean, 4 or 5 hostages getting out, it is the clear opinion of the Netanyahu government or Netanyahu himself, that Hamas is not going to give anybody else up. And that there's evidence that Hamas was regaining a certain amount of possible economic strength. Piece in the Jerusalem Post claims that Hamas has been getting non-cash assets in the form of oil barrels and things like that brought to it through by the sea that will give it essentially forms of money to keep going. In whatever form they can go. So this is the situation we're in. And in Israel, the opposition is saying that he's only doing this to forestall his own inevitable collapse and his conviction in the corruption trials. And there's now a new claim that people in the Israeli government were getting paid off by Qatar. Nobody is saying that he was being paid off by Qatar. And there's another controversy in Israel about the firing of the director of the security services. You will be interested to know, if you live in America, and we are having, of course, all this stuff about what rights the president has to fire staffers, low-level staffers in the administration, and who's doing it, which we can get to. But you'll be interested to know that there seems to be some controversy over whether or not the prime minister of the country has the right to choose the head of the security services that he would want. There is no process by which in Israel people who are in senior positions in the government are confirmed by anybody. There is no written constitution. And courts are literally saying, a court in Israel, the attorney general, who also doesn't quite seem to work for the prime minister, is saying, no, you're not allowed to fire him unless you can show a good reason to fire him. So Israel has an eccentric political system, as people may know, and so this eccentricity is now showing itself. So it may well be that the foremost supporter of Bibi's effort to go into Gaza and finish things off is not the Israeli public, but rather the White House, which seems, I think, based on some of the things that Steve Witkoff, the negotiator, was saying, and things that Trump hasn't said, is basically like, okay, we're done with this too. We've had it. We gave it 2 months. We said nice things about Hamas, which got us a lot of trouble. And look what they have. They won't even let the American out. Like we're now killing Houthis, and maybe Israel should go kill Hamasniks the way we're killing Houthis.
My only correction to your summary is Adam Bowler said nice things about Hamas, not the entire administration.
Okay, fair enough.
And then his nomination was pulled, and he'll be doing things in the basement there with Milton from Office Space with the hostage negotiations. Yeah,
keep a hand on your stapler.
He better not take
he turned up. He turned up.
He
called a conference, by the way, and I saw a headline that he was calling a conference of envoys in Big Sky, Montana, which is I think the envoy version of we sent him to live on a farm.
Yeah,
a nice family.
Yes. The puppy was sent to the farm upstate.
I mean, right. I think the key here is that Hamas was benefiting from the ceasefire, especially the period at which the hostage releases ended and the resumption of the war 24 hours ago. That limbo helped Hamas. Hamas was rearming, Hamas was recruiting, Hamas was selling the aid it steals, feeding off of it, and that status quo benefited Hamas. And then Hamas used that limbo in order to split America from Israel. And that was the direct negotiation attempt. That was Hamas's false claim that they would release Adon Alexander, the remaining American living hostage. But that failed. And first we saw the Trump administration begin the attacks on the Houthis. And we heard Steve Witkoff say that Hamas should pay attention to what's happening with the Houthis. And then within a day, Israel had this, I think, extremely effective surprise strike on Hamas leadership. And the war has begun again. So Hamas was milking this interregnum for all it was worth. And that doesn't solve anything for Hamas to be stronger, for Hamas to keep the remaining living hostages, for Hamas to benefit from the political situation in Israel. That does not make the world a safer place. And just final point, I'd say, you're right, John, to suggest that the Trump administration is looking at this like, well, we have a lot else to deal with. Let Israel take care of Hamas. Because, of course, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today later, but Trump is dead set, it seems, on ending this war in Ukraine and exerting a lot of political capital in what I believe to be futile negotiations with Vladimir Putin. But that's what's occupying his attention, not the Israel-Hamas conflict, on which he is certainly on Israel's side.
Right. So why don't we move there? We move on to Ukraine, and then we can move to the domestic controversies. 2-hour phone call with Putin. Unusual in that Trump did not follow that 2-hour phone call with a 3-hour press conference in the Oval Office in which he just said anything that came to his head. Clearly,
because it was a perfect call.
It's a perfect call, but he is keeping it close to his. He's keeping his cards. He's very interested in cards in Ukraine and Russia. He's keeping his cards close to the vest. He and Zelensky are supposed to have a phone call today for Zelensky to find out what Trump and Putin talked about on the phone call yesterday that he doesn't want to talk about. Interestingly enough, and I don't want to go too far with this because it just indicates that the American people aren't that engaged, is my guess. But the polling on the American attitude toward Russia, Ukraine, Trump, and the war is not in Trump's favor. And I'm struck by this. Like, I'm actually legitimately surprised because I would have assumed after all this time and Trump pushing and the idea that whenever you ask people, do you want a war to stop, they would say they want the war to stop. It remains that 2/3 of the American people, close to 2/3, sympathize with Ukraine and do not sympathize with Russia. The immediate polling in the aftermath of the yelling at Zelensky meeting in the White House that suggested that Trump had benefited from that has flipped. 3 different polls show that people think that Trump was disrespectful to Zelensky, not that Zelensky was disrespectful to Trump. And the American people still seem to be emotionally in sympathy with Ukraine. Now, that doesn't mean that they care that much about whether the war goes on or doesn't go on. But Trump throwing in his now notorious cards with Putin against the supposed dictatorial Zelensky has not benefited him politically, at the very least. And it's possible that his effort to come out and say, I am the peacemaker, I stopped this terrible war from happening, that will help him in the United States when, in fact, people in the United States are supportive of the country that is trying to save itself from the Russian bear. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't have a larger perspective on it. I just think that
there was pretty striking numbers that came out just yesterday. One question asked, would you rather have the war end with a ceasefire or with Ukraine regaining its lost territory? And a slight majority favored, or plurality, I should say, Ukraine regaining lost territory. So that's definitely the
which is a
Ukrainian
war
view.
aim that would mean that they support 2 more years of war. That's what's interesting is if you were to translate that into what policy would be. Ceasefire is a policy, but Ukraine regaining lost territory means the war is on hot and heavy, and we give Ukraine weapons and
Yeah.
we help them regain their lost territory, which is something that I think we've all kind of regrettably conceded is unlikely to happen given the order of battle
It's the nature of the war there.
and the
Yeah.
attitude of the American administration. So, and the administration before it, which is what led to Ukraine losing its territory. But whatever. Okay.
I think in part that polling reflects something among the many intelligent things Zelensky has done throughout the course of this is when he makes his appeals and his speeches of appreciation for American aid and support, he always very specifically says the American people. The Ukrainian people thank the American people. I thank the American people. He tries to sort of put the cause in the hearts of Americans, as opposed to just appealing to the leadership. And I think it's been effective.
I
Yeah,
just think
no,
one of the
I also
facts of the
think.
matter. Sorry,
Yeah, no,
sorry, Stetson.
I also think that the American people understand the difference between a war that America is fighting with its own service members and a war that America is supporting an ally in, right? There's the argument from a segment of the right, from the MAGA right, has been it's not our war, it's not our fight, who cares what happens, etc. But but also we can stop it, right? When you say Ukraine should be allowed to fight on, the response you get from a lot of MAGA right people is, why do you want the war to go on? Why do you want more people to die? Why do you want Ukrainians to die? And so I think what Americans, on a larger sense, understand, though, is that it's the fact that we're not the main party in the war, in the ground war itself, means that we can't actually just stop all these wars. We can only stop supporting a certain side, right? I think the American people get that this is not a war, a ground war between the United States or NATO and Russia. And therefore, if the United States pulls out of the war, the two combatants are still in the war. And it's like that in the Middle East too, right? There's this idea that, the same commentators have come out and said, look, Trump should pressure Israel because all this death and devastation has to stop, and we can stop it. But the truth is that we can't stop war from happening in the Middle East between Hamas and the nation that Hamas is forever trying to destroy. We can only stop supporting our ally. And I think that's reflected in the polls, that the American people understand that we can't just snap our fingers and make everybody stop dying and bring peace on earth. It's not in our control.
Well,
That part is not in our control.
To build on that, I think what you're saying is that the American people have more moral clarity about the situation that's lacking in many places, especially on parts of the MAGA media sphere. That there's a lot of just muscle memory in America about Russia. We don't like Russia. We don't like Putin. Putin's a bad guy. The Russian government has this tendency to invade people and to kill people and to oppress people. That's just the way it's been in Russia, with very small exceptions for centuries. And Americans know that. And so the polling reflects that. And so I think what you see with this division is just Americans have a instinctual skepticism or opposition to Russia. And I think that's justified. And on Hamas, it's the same way. I mean, we have seen, of course, the shift among Democrats on the Palestinian issue, but by and large, the American people still see that Israel has a right to exist, and that the terrorist forces that are trying to destroy the state of Israel are not only wrong, they're evil. And so I think that amidst a lot of, shall we say, unsettling headlines or disturbing headlines or headlines that come out of the blue and you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. The basic sense of the American electorate is quite reassuring.
I find we talk in broad brush about what the American people know and don't know, and we have all this horrible evidence of how our educational system has failed us over the past 40 years. Nobody can find anything on a map. People don't know what anything is. It's like the old Jay Leno asking people outside the Jay Leno theater, you know, what is the capital of New York City? And they say New York State, you know, that kind of, the American people are stupid, right? Or that the American people don't know anything, and they certainly don't know anything about foreign policy. They don't know where Ukraine is. They don't know where Israel is. They don't know anything. Okay, so there's that layer on top of understanding these kinds of numbers, which everybody can default to. In other words, when you don't like where the polling goes on some of this stuff, you can say, well, everybody's stupid and they don't really understand the issue. But let's be fair to the American people, dumb or not. Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. It's not like this happened 20 years ago. It's not like it happened 40 years ago. Russia rolled tanks into its neighbor without a casus belli 3 years ago. And the entire American political system, with the exception of MAGA, was like, this is terrible. They're not allowed to do this. And the entire West said, this is terrible. They're not allowed to do this. And memory holing that, it's a little too soon to memory hole that. It's literally 3 years and a month. It's not like it, you know, it's not like you can start having arguments about whether or not we should have gone into Afghanistan or into Iraq or whatever like that. This just happened, and Russia there is no argument outside of psychotic Russian arguments that Zelensky is a Nazi, or that Ukraine is actually really Russia, or that, you know, all the pretexts that he needs to denazify it and protect the Russians who live in Ukraine and that kind of thing. Nobody buys that outside of Tucker Carlson's mouth-breathing, drooling, anti-Semitic, psychotic audiences. Nobody. So when you ask the question, I guess it makes perfect sense that the American people writ large say, well, I mean, if you're not asking me how involved we should be, all things being equal, Ukraine should get its territory back. Why should Russia have it? Because it just, in historical terms, it just happened and nothing has changed. It's not like, oh my God, the Ukrainians massacred 10 million Russians and therefore we're changing sides in this war. That's, you know, like we can give them a little credit for being the ones who are not going through the reality distortion field, according to which this is really all NATO's fault. Well, because in 1990, because NATO said maybe we would let Ukraine into NATO. How about in 1993 when we said to Ukraine, throw away all your nuclear weapons and we'll make sure that Russia doesn't swallow you whole? You know, why don't we go back to that, John Mearsheimer? Let's go back to that time. That's the time.
Well, he said that was a mistake at the time.
Well, he did say it was a mistake, and he was right. But I'm just saying, like,
there is an important question just about that '94 agreement, the Budapest memorandum, which is this. I wish people would ask them. You know, this is me asking them, what are Americans' obligations because of that? You may think that we shouldn't have signed it, but we did. We also knew exactly what we were doing when we signed. Like, we understood that the reason we had to sign an agreement where we said we would support the territorial integrity of Ukraine is because we knew that Russia would try to swallow it up as soon as it could. So I understand that there are limits, right? Maybe our obligations on that is not, they're not limitless and they're not about American troops, but there has to be something, right? The agreement we signed to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity, there has to be something specific that it requires us to do. And I have not heard anybody on the other side willing to admit that we are required to do anything at all based on this treaty.
Okay, so this is a good segue into talking about everything else that's going on domestically.
Well, can we just?
Yeah, I had a point too.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Abe, you make your point, but then I want to talk about what the readout of the call was.
Oh, okay. Well, my point is about this too. So I'm concerned about what happens in the immediate future here, because clearly Putin is playing for time, is trying to stay in Trump's good graces, trying to pretend that he's somewhere on that road to a ceasefire when he's not. And Trump is going to have to go to the Ukrainians and say, Putin says he won't strike your energy production. He thinks this is all a good idea. Don't be an obstacle here. Don't be an obstacle to peace. And I fear we're going to jump back onto that timeline. That's all I want to say.
Right. The readout of the call yesterday was that Putin and Trump had agreed to a ceasefire on attacks on oil, energy, and infrastructure. But then they would begin a process of negotiations in Saudi Arabia for a maritime ceasefire, so in the Black Sea. And then they would talk about an actual ceasefire between the ground forces and the drones and the artillery that is doing most of the killing and the destruction on the front lines. And then they would talk about peace. So this was a very long road that they laid out. And my worry is that this initial peace, even if it's observed, and both combatants attacked one another's energy infrastructure within hours of this call. So it's unclear whether the ceasefire is going to be observed even at this level of the energy infrastructure. But if it is, we should note that it's denying Ukraine one of its main weapons in this war, which is, Ukraine, as we hear from Vice President Vance all the time, does have a manpower shortage. The issue on the front lines, it's basically a very difficult war to maneuver because of the technology, where these Dragon drones essentially immobilize forces. So what's the leverage that Ukraine had? Well, Ukraine had been conducting these long-range strikes into Russia to destroy the refinery capacity, and that has hurt the Russian economy. Denying Ukraine that may well protect its own energy infrastructure, but it also helps the Russian economy recover. So I think that's why Putin went to this place at first. That's he wanted to do it because it helps his position domestically. To quote our president, Russia, 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 we hear a lot of things about how Russia's strong, Russia's survived these sanctions. But the truth of the matter is that Putin has been having to deal with problems in the economy, in particular, these attacks on the energy infrastructure. So my eye immediately went to that first part because I certainly want the war to end as much as anyone, but removing that tool from Ukraine is just another piece of leverage that Ukraine does not have in these negotiations.
I mean, I want the war to end too. I want the war to end with Ukraine getting all its territory back and Russia being humiliated and destroyed on the national stage. I'm not going to get what I want,
right?
Very clearly, but I mean, saying that one wants the war to end is itself. This is the problem for Trump, which is that saying you want the war to end now, with everything sort of frozen in place, is to say Russia didn't win because it didn't overtake and overrun Kyiv and take Ukraine yet. But it is to say that Russia effectively...
I believe that if the war were to end today on the current lines with Ukrainian security guarantees, that would be a defeat for Russia. Even on the current lines. Putin would not be able to explain that. But I don't think that's going to happen as much as your scenario is going to happen.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's an interesting question about what it is that is best for Putin. It may well be good for Putin to say, I won, and then to sort of be able to demilitarize a little bit so that he isn't putting domestic pressure on his own population to.
If the war ended today, John, on the current lines, he would not have won by his own standards, because let's not forget, he has not moved at all. Right. His current standards, he wants Ukraine, he wants Zelensky gone, he wants
the Ukrainians will believe that it is a defeat of them.
Yeah.
So then they're both defeated according to that scenario, and maybe you're right. I mean, maybe in some large understanding. So the Ukrainian nation will have to agree to have settled to being a smaller country with 2 giant bites taken out of it before this war started, and then some small amount of territory seized by Russia after the war started, with no concomitant gains of its own, including and losing the support of its great ally, the United States.
Again, we're just speculating here,
Yeah.
but it's Wednesday morning, so why not?
Yeah.
If that's the case, but Ukraine has your EU membership, if Ukraine has the support of the United Kingdom and France and Australia and other countries that have been pledging that they would put troops in Ukraine as a security guarantee, NATO will have expanded.
Yeah.
So I just think that again, there is.
Okay. You're talking. Okay.
And did South Korea think they lost when their country was partitioned? And I'm not arguing for a full partition of Ukraine. I'm just saying if that's what we get, in my view, that's the best scenario at this point.
Right, but it's the best scenario at this point because of basically.
No, it's very hard for Ukraine to retake its territory. We've known that.
And I agree with that, and I'm not
absent American intervention. The only way only way Ukraine would get its territory back is if we went into the war, and I don't think we should go into the war.
Right. Okay. I am not. Look, we were willing to live with Crimea and the Donbass in Russian hands before the war started, right? I mean, effectively, we didn't recognize the annexation of Donbass.
And we shouldn't. And we should not. That would be a terrible concession if Trump made that.
We didn't recognize the subjugation of the Baltic states, but we didn't do anything about it until the wall fell. We don't have to recognize it, and that would be our flying the moral flag but I just don't know if Trump is going to fly any moral flags. And that's why I want to get to this other question here, which is the sort of the domestic war on Trump and Trump's role in the domestic war on Trump. So Seth said, what are our obligations to a piece of paper that we signed 30 years ago? And I think increasingly the problem that Trump is facing in a conservative country, and America is a conservative country, and I don't mean politically conservative, it's right wing, I mean that it is a conservative country in that it does not like rapid change, as we are now seeing with the revolt against the gender stuff and some other things. Trump has come into this administration as though, I'm not saying he's Robespierre, but as though it is year zero, and all precedents are null and void. If he didn't sign it, if it's not his idea, if he didn't approve it in the first place, he is going to run roughshod over all kinds of American traditions. And some of that we obviously like, because some of those traditions are actually relatively new and totally untested and ridiculous. Like the thing that says that a president isn't allowed to fire his U.S. attorneys, or like get rid of federal employees or whatever. All that stuff that he isn't allowed to shrink the government, that he isn't allowed to play a role in figuring out where things go budgetarily. However, I am increasingly convinced by the arguments largely made by Andy McCarthy, but by other, and I cite Andy McCarthy, the former the writer for National Review, writes for us to, prosecutor of the blind sheikh, very important and serious legal thinker, who says that what has been going on since the weekend with the Trenda Aragua case and the relations between the administration and Judge Boasberg are a constitutional calamity, and that it is not the case that people can just be loaded onto a plane and flown to a third country and let off the plane from American territory when we don't know who they are, and when they have not been identified either by law enforcement in some formal fashion or by courts as actually having been members of this horrible gang, all of whose members should leave the country. We don't know who they are. We are not told who they are, and the administration says it is not required to tell the judge who they are or to provide the judge with any visibility into the decision-making process, how it worked, or how it happened, because this is a national security issue. And I wanted to take the administration's side, and I think politically, by the way, this could be a winner for the administration, just in naked raw terms, that he can say, look, the Democrats are supporting this Venezuelan murder gang instead of, the security and safety of the American people.
Yeah, because, by the way, the people who are protesting this, had the administration done it correctly, would still be protesting.
You're absolutely right, and they protest everything, right? So now we have judges saying Trump isn't allowed to make rules about trans in the military. He's not allowed. A judge says that all the firings in the federal government have to be, because Elon Musk doesn't have statutory authority to fire anybody, when there's literally no evidence that in statutory terms Elon Musk has fired anybody. Elon Musk hasn't signed a piece of paper that says I'm firing everybody. There may be an issue with Kari Lake, who seems to have somehow shut down the Voice of America without having been confirmed as head of anything by the Senate. So she's enacting something or other and may not have statutory authority to do that. There are people in this administration who are doing things that they may not have statutory authority to do. But Elon Musk is an advisor to the president, acting the president's stead. And that one judge says he's not allowed to, and everybody that has been laid off as a result of Doge has to be rehired. That's not this. That's not what I'm talking about. A specific action was taken where people on American soil were flown out of the United States without any review, or without any documents being produced to explain that it was proved that they were members of Trendaragua, that they had no, or whatever, or even that they're all illegals, because there were a couple hundred of them. What if somebody was swept up in a dragnet and is, there under fault and is an American citizen or whatever? We don't even know that. So there is about the recklessness with which the Trump administration is pursuing this. We got to run 1,000 miles an hour because we only have 2 years to do this, may have real serious blowback consequences here. And I also wonder whether it really is past time, even though we're only, whatever this is, 8 or 9 weeks into this administration. The Supreme Court is going to have to make up its mind whether or not it is legitimate for a district court to issue a stay that controls the entirety of the federal government.
Well, I think you just hit on why the events of last weekend happened. I think that's what the administration wants. They want to force this decision over national injunctions by district court judges. And it's a problem that affected the Trump administration the first go around. Nationwide injunctions did affect the Biden administration, but at a much lower rate. But now we've seen in the first...
Well, and the Obama administration, to be fair, nationwide injunctions were put in place on Obama's pen and phone actions, right? I mean, a single district court judge in Texas ended the DACA, the legalization of the illegals that Obama attempted.
And I think he appealed that, right? And then went up to the
appeal
Supreme,
it
right.
and lost the appeal. By the way,
the interesting thing to me was Roberts' comments yesterday, because amidst
Chief Justice Roberts,
because amidst this argument between the administration and the district court judge, it's Boasberger, is that
Boasberg, Jed
Boasberg, yeah. Between the administration is not being very forthcoming with the judge, even if
the opposite, like is
exactly.
deliberately being unforthcoming,
right? And then on top of that, MAGA and President Trump have called for the judge's impeachment, and so Justice Roberts issued this statement yesterday that was very brief, and it didn't mention Trump, it didn't mention the judge in question. It just said that impeachment is not the appropriate manner to resolve judicial disputes. Appealing is the way to go. The appellate process is the way to go, period. Just 2 sentences. I think that's Roberts saying, just appeal the case. Get it up to us so we can figure it out. And I think among the issues that need to be figured out, one is whether there was a violation of the court order when the planes did not turn around, as this single judge ordered the president to turn around the planes carrying these alleged criminal migrants to El Salvador. But two, the question of the nationwide injunctions, because we know that Justice Thomas, for example, has wanted to crack down on them for some time. But that's the only way you get any resolution, is when it actually does reach the Supreme Court.
Right. But he hasn't even, that's the point in all these cases. There aren't even rulings.
No, usually it's the shadow docket.
These are called TROs. These are temporary restraining orders. So the thing that has frozen the Mahmoud Khalil deportation in place is a TRO, is a temporary restraining order. Judge Boasberg placed a temporary restraining order on the administration's flights, and then he said, oh, we were supposed to turn it back. The TRO was very clear, said you should turn the planes around. And the administration said, it's an interesting Talmudic dispute. It's like, well, you said it in the courtroom, but you didn't say it on the piece of paper. So the piece of paper outweighs what you said in the courtroom.
It was also the time zone.
Yeah, there's a time zone. Right. So there's a Talmudic. This is a
time to Daven Shacharis on the plane, where the plane is, but not from where you just left.
This is literally what the Talmud is like, right? It's like, what if the plane is in the air? Should it be turned around? Or what if it's on the paper, but it also was said? Does the saying outweigh the papering, or does the papering outweigh the saying? And Rabbi this one says that, and Rabbi Tarfon says that, and Rabbi Shmulik says this, and they don't resolve it. That's the thing with the Talmud, is the arguments are all laid out, and it's not like there's a ruling. So the administration and Judge Boasberg are playing the Sanhedrin and having a Talmudic, or having basically Talmudic arguments here. And at some point, he's got a rule, and then they can appeal. But like, even this case where Musk was found yesterday to have overstepped his authority and everybody has to be returned to their jobs, isn't a ruling. It is an order that says this needs to go forward because there is according to the judge, who I think is wrong, there is a high level of possibility that this will win on appeal. So therefore, don't even do it to start out with.
That case is a head scratcher. That's the USAID case.
Yes.
This is the judge saying that actually we need to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Yes.
Because Elon Musk has no official role or power over this agency, even though Elon has never really claimed any official power over this agency.
That's my point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. He's the first buddy.
And then they named the administration,
that lady.
They named that lady as the person who runs the office that theoretically can.
And I think Doge, I will say that I think Doge has gotten a little bit better now at working with the agency heads after the pushback from the cabinet secretaries. There was that initial moment, and during which, of course, USAID was blown apart, where Doge would just come into an agency and just start ordering things around, and people within the agencies would say, hey, you have to go through the actual chain of command here. I think they've begun to learn that a little bit.
We watched them take the letters USAID off the off the
USAID was definitely targeted for very specific political reasons, mainly because
specific political reasons, and because somebody was not dumb. It has a weird status within the government that other agencies don't have.
And that Republicans on the Hill have been complaining about USAID for decades.
Right. So that's the political matter. But actually, statutorily, USAID does exist in some slightly peculiar nether.
And now Rubio is technically head of it.
Right. So they made him,
so this decision is just kind of very confusing. And I thought that the New York Times write-up of it was kind of funny in a way, because at the end, the reporter was talking to USAID people, and they were like, well, I don't know what we're going to do, because basically it's all over. There's nothing left to put that back together.
Who's the counterparty? That's the interesting problem is, I guess, you could get some kind of a class action suit from fired U.S.
Well, I
aid
think
employees.
these were some employees. They're represented by Norm Eisen, of course.
Right, Norm Eisen, yes.
The contrarian. And this suit is novel in the sense that it's actually targeting Musk. The other lawsuits don't. But I think this particular decision is a head scratcher and unlikely to stand.
But the other thing about the chaos with USAID and similar situations is that people losing jobs are employees of contractors who have had their contracts with USAID canceled, right? So they are getting a series of notices every time the judge updates this. I don't mean to laugh, but I mean, it's to look at it from their perspective. These companies are getting a series of notices where it will, will end a contract, and then it will get a notice that that has been revoked or suspended, and then they've gotten notices that the revocation has been revoked. And so you have to add the number of negatives together in the emails you got to see whether you still have a contract or not. And so that is really Humpty Dumpty. I mean, companies that have contracts with USAID have fired people because they lost the contract. Now you're sort of 3 degrees removed from the federal government itself, those employees. At some point, the judges are going to have to, and soon, going to have to do something that sorts this out and makes it clear, because it's far beyond even just the federal government that is affected by the confusion. And those companies won't be hiring people back based on the revocation of the revocation, because the second revocation might have been an error and the first revocation was not. This is a kind of insane chaos that goes far beyond people who work for USAID. And the judges have to consider the larger effect on this and figure out some way to come to a decision on, are these contracts to be enforced? Do these people have jobs? Yes or no?
Okay, but to get back to the sort of the point that I began with, which is as I described it, this sort of year zero, Trump year zero. It is Trump's position that every aspect of that which is organized under the executive branch is his fiat, is his by fiat. And the problem is that really isn't true. U.S. government is fiendishly complicated, and there are a lot of these weird bodies. The one that is now sort of like in the news that you've never heard of, but I've heard of, is the U.S. Institute for Peace. It is nominally part of the executive branch, but it reports to Congress. It has a semi-independent board. Theoretically, it's overseen by the executive branch, but they're called quasi-independent agencies for a reason, which is to say they can't really be independent. And the Supreme Court did say that these efforts sometimes to set up independent agencies that don't seem to report to anybody are totally manifestly unconstitutional. That was the problem with the Elizabeth Warren I can't remember the name of the bureau that she
Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Thank you. Because she could not get confirmed as head of that bureau, she ended up in the Senate. So maybe the Senate should just have confirmed her, and then she would have.
That's now closed too.
That is now closed too, right? But
and soon the Senate will be closed.
Let's not joke about that.
Yeah, but anyway, I think what I'm saying is they wanted to hit the ground running. Matt said they want to have these. They want to have these fights.
Yeah.
There's a point at which I think that the innate conservatism of the American electorate or the American people and the Trump year zero thing are going to come smashing into each other. And I don't know what point that is. And because I like a lot of what he's done and doing, I've been inclined to be defensive of some of it, particularly the Mahmoud Khalil deportation, which I continue to believe, having spent time reading the statutes and reading all sorts of stuff about it, does pass constitutional muster. But I don't think they wanted that fight, by the way. I still think that they made a mistake. They made a category mistake. They thought he was on a student visa and nobody checked to make sure he didn't have a green
I
card.
mean, there too, I think they wanted to have the fight about whether they can remove green card holders.
Right.
Okay, but
Yeah,
I don't think that's more Machiavellian than what happened here, because
Have
then
you
the
paid
ice
attention to Stephen Miller? He knows these things, and he has
he
an
does
agenda.
know it. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
I think, John,
yeah.
considering what Matt said, I think depending on the resolution of these issues, the American people will either say, okay, enough with Trump trying to break everything and do things the wrong way and having a fight over every day over every new rolled out policy and decision, or they will say, all right, enough with this, attempted governance by courts, by federal judges. I mean, they're the ones that are, also mucking everything up here, depending on how this rolls out.
There is precedent for that, and there is historical precedent for what you're talking about, Abe, which is that the Supreme Court in the late 60s and early 70s got very radical. People sort of don't know this. The Supreme Court overturned and declared unconstitutional the one punishment that is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, which is the death penalty, which is mentioned as an enforcement mechanism in the Constitution for the act of treason. And the Supreme Court said the death penalty was unconstitutional. And then 4 years later, the Supreme Court said, oops, I guess we really shouldn't have said that. But the Supreme Court in the 60s and 70s and courts then followed them. They were the leading edge, they weren't the backstop for constitutional order. They were the leading edge of pushing the constitutional boundaries of what was understood to be American law. And that became a political issue. That became a huge political issue in the United States, that the courts were on the side of the criminals and not of the victims, that the courts were more interested in helping, in not making sure that ordinary life had order, or that the views of people in their communities were respected, but were running roughshod over those views and those people and those communities. And it was part and parcel of the thing that helped create the Reagan Revolution. So you're right to say, I think, that handled correctly, this could be a political game changer. And some of these judges are behaving crazy, particularly the one who announced that Trump doesn't have the right to say that there are only two genders in the military, which is crazy. And the judge in the judge's finding said, I've done my own research into this and I know there are more than two genders. No, that's not the way it works.
Google it, Mr. President.
Yeah, I believe you.
No, you want to look at that judge's search history.
I also have opinions, and therefore will control the U.S. military's policies.
I think politically this works for Trump. Think about FDR and his fight against the 9 old men. Mm-hmm. And it's true, FDR didn't get all that he wanted. He didn't get his court packing scheme, but he was able to pressure the judiciary in a way that, paradoxically, to what you were saying earlier, caused the judiciary to extend its own power for much of the middle part of the 20th century, right, and really trying to create the legal precedents that now Trump is trying to push back against, and the Supreme Court has pushed back against too in some of its rulings, whether it's on independent agencies or whether it's on Chevron deference. So from the Trump administration's point of view, Trump is pushing for presidential powers and presidential authorities that other presidents really haven't claimed. And the only break right now is the judiciary. But the district court judges simply don't have, I think, the legitimacy that the Supreme Court does, or even the D.C. Circuit does.
By definition, right? Because everybody knows that there are a lot of judges in America. And who the hell are they?
And you can go forum shopping, right?
Voted for this guy.
A plaintiff, as we see in case after case these days, the plaintiffs know, the ACLU knows which judge to go to for the ruling that they want. And so this fight, I think, helps Trump politically The question is where will it begin to overstep, and when will you see public opinion turn? Right now, I don't think we're there. Trump's opinion polls have been declining, but only slightly. And I'll plug my piece in the Free Press today. I have a piece about how one reason that Trump is still, kind of, treading water in the Real Clear Politics average is that the electorate continues to be slightly Republican. When you look at the internal composition of these
for
polls,
the first time in 100 years.
Right. That was
Literally.
the exit poll, but it's continuing into the polling today.
Yeah.
And so when you have just more Republicans in the country, that gives Trump a lot of more room, not just in his job approval ratings are going to be elevated compared to where they were certainly this time 8 years ago, but also in the type of powers he wants to enact in his office. The real crisis will come if the Supreme Court orders him to do something and he disobeys. And we're not there yet. And in fact, we have never been there in American history.
Right. So I think that the political argument that you make is sound, and that the deliberate decision of the Trump administration to just flood the zone everywhere all at once has definite political advantages. It can also, and we're not there, and I don't know that we're there, and just because the New York Times says we're in a constitutional crisis doesn't mean we're in a constitutional crisis. Temporary restraining orders are not rulings. Appeals courts haven't been heard. The Supreme Court hasn't been heard. All of that. We're not in a constitutional crisis. The administration is allowed to attempt to advance policies. People are allowed to sue it. Process goes forward. This idea that what Trump is doing isn't legitimate is ridiculous. However, that doesn't mean that the arguments that they're making on behalf of the things that they're doing are correct. And intellectual honesty and consistency over what it means to be a conservative, I think, requires us to say things like, I don't know, if there's one person on the Tren de Aragua plane who was like caught in a dragnet and thrown in the back of a van and then put on a plane and flown to El Salvador, who has no business being there, that kind of invalidates the entire process. Or does it? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe, if you're going to break some eggs, if you make an omelet, it's going to help him politically because Democrats are falling into the trap, right? They're defending Mahmoud Khalil. They're defending Tren de Aragua. They're defending, Trump saying there are only two genders in the military, someone saying, no, Trump doesn't have the right to say there are only two genders. And they're defending federal workers from dismissal. And as we said, when this all started, the week after it all started, the American people as a whole have lived through 25 years of layoffs, of companies closing, of people having to find new jobs. The idea that there is supposed to be some exemption and that everybody who works for the federal government has lifetime tenure is not something, if you come face to face with it, that the American people are going to feel comfortable with. Why did they get special privileges to stay in their jobs when I got laid off, or my uncle got laid off, or my cousin got laid off? That's just not right. And they make a lot of money. I didn't even know how much money they made, which is another thing that gets exposed by this. So the politics are very complicated, but as I say, intellectual honesty, I wanted to talk about this because my own view on this shifted over the last 4 or 5 days as a result of the argumentation. And I think that we have to be, you can call me a wimp if you want, but I just find that.
No, I mean, look
no,
at
not you. I'm not saying you're calling me a wimp.
I think that's why Andy is so important. That's why Ed Whalen is so important.
These are people you cannot say that Ed Whalen, who runs the Ethics and Public Policy Center and has been a legal scholar on the right for 30 years, that Ed Whalen is a squish on court matters.
No, and part of the problem. I'm a political analyst. Yeah. I think I know a little bit about politics. I've studied it very closely for 2 decades, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm a simple caveman pundit. And so I have to rely on lawyers for some of the arguments here. And so Andy, Ed, I thought it was very interesting that Jonathan Turley said that Trump's claim to have voided Biden's pardons because the auto pen is a non-starter, right? So there are a few lawyers that I respect that I turn to, And yeah, if they raise qualms or objections, they're worth. Also, our friend Hugh Hewitt, he has a legal degree, so I'm looking at him, and he doesn't quite agree
He's
sometimes.
a law professor.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what makes political analysis more complicated and more difficult in year zero is that it's really legal analysis. You really have to understand the law.
Yeah.
And some of our brains are just not built for that.
Right. But I mean, just to cross dot I's and cross T's here. So it has been an act since Trump arose that people like us get called rhinos if we oppose Trump, or we're not really Republican, we're not conservatives. What do we know? So Ed Whalen, just to give you an example. So Ed Whalen has at National Review for 10 years done a feature called This Day in Judicial Activism.
Yeah, he knows.
Like, he literally goes through and he says, on this day, 22 years ago, a court in Ohio said that, it was okay to seize somebody's farm in order for, someone to build a casino on it. And no one stopped them. And then it led to the Kelo decision or something, whatever. I've been fighting in these trenches for more than 4 decades, Ed Whalen for 3 decades. If you think that you can trump us by saying we're not right wing because we don't accept everything that comes out of Trump's mouth. Trump, who yesterday endorsed the Trudeau successor for prime minister in Canada on the grounds that Pierre Poilievre, the conservative candidate, was saying mean things about him last week because of the Canada 51st state thing, as Poilievre desperately tries to save his candidacy and succeed to the premiership, which is something that every right-winger in the world should want.
He's trying to save his candidacy from
Trump and the 51st state.
Wouldn't that help him if Trump is endorsing Carney?
Okay, interesting point. See how
nine-dimensional chess, John.
Okay, okay, 9-dimensional chess. This is a guy who got bankrupt owning a casino. So I don't think he plays 9-dimensional chess, because no one ever went bankrupt owning a casino.
All I'm saying is that you don't want to be close to Trump in Canada these days.
Fair enough.
And for Trump to say, I don't like Poilievre because he's been mean to me, might actually help him.
I don't know. Maybe people in Alberta and Calgary and Saskatchewan would like to be part of the United States. Who knows?
He could encourage Quebec's separatism and then really make trouble for people.
There we go. Yeah, that would be fun. We should take in Canada, so we should have a civil war with the Quebecois separatists.
Arm the moderate Canadians.
That would be great. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know how the Quebecois will deal with Trump's executive order making English the official language of the United States if Canada becomes
that would be great.
The 51st state.
Canada and starts pulling down all the French language.
It's kind of a complication that I don't think our president has addressed yet.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yes. You know that when the Parti Québécois announced that according to its federalist rules, no signage in Quebec was allowed to be in English at all. In other words, not even joint, things like that, right? So the famous Schwartz's Smoked Meats, a deli in Montreal that is where you get the best pastrami in Montreal, had to become Charcuterie Schwartz, right? I say return Schwartz's to the smoked meat from which it came. That's what I say.
Well, this is the world we now live in.
So. Yes, it is. Okay, well, I don't think we have a recommendation today, so until tomorrow, for Seth, Matt, and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.